Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Carl Block. Carl is a partner in the law firm of Loeb & Loeb here in Los Angeles, California. He will be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Listen, learn, and enjoy as he leaves no stone unturned during deep conversations with some of today's most amazing business leaders. Welcome to the show. Carl Block is both a corporate lawyer and a corporate restructuring partner in the Los Angeles office of Loeb & Loeb LLP. Nothing in the podcast should be construed as legal advice. To the extent legal issues are discussed, please consult an attorney if you have any questions or need advice relating to the matters discussed. This podcast may constitute attorney advertising in certain jurisdictions. The views expressed in the podcast are not necessarily the views of Loeb & Loeb or Carl Block. Carl and each guest reserves the right to change any opinions that may be expressed on the show and disagree with what others say, even if such disagreement is not expressed during the podcast.
On today's version of the Block and Tackle Show, I have a distinguished lawyer from Loeb & Loeb, Paul Rohrer. Paul is the Los Angeles Deputy Chair of Real Estate in the Loeb & Loeb law firm, and he's also part of the intergalactic Loeb & Loeb real estate team. He focuses his practice on development, principally for institutional clients, including developers, tech companies, studios, colleges, healthcare providers, and governmental entities. He works closely with public and private entities in the development and operation of buildings and infrastructure. Paul, welcome to the Block and Tackle Show.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Great to see you.
You too. So, Paul, you're in a practice area that, as much as, and perhaps more than many others, went through or has gone through or is going through the most significant period of change, mostly because the pandemic caused a lot of fissures and a lot of things happened that were crazy, and it's affected almost every aspect of real estate, the public markets or the public properties, commercial real estate, residential real estate, industrial real estate. It's all been affected to some degree, how new development happens and how financing happens. What do you see as the biggest challenges today?
Right. Well, there's a lot of them. And as you said, there's been a lot of large changes from the pandemic. There's also been changes from the financial market. Going first sort of to the pandemic, I mean, if you look back at the plague is said to have ended the feudal system in Europe, right? It had really big changes for the economy. And I don't know that this was as big as the plague, but I think it does have real changes for our economy. And it certainly had changes for how we're using land and buildings. On top of that, we've now had a really sort of drastic change over the last year in interest rates, right? We've gone from a long period of money being free to a period of money getting back to, certainly relatively expensive to what it was, right? This is a really steep increase from what it was, but, we're back more at historical levels.
Sure. And so when you had all that free money, then I assume you had a lot of risk. Most people think that developers are cowboys and big risk takers anyway. And then when you're giving them money, it's like giving a gambler money in Vegas, some people might say. So, I assume that in your practice, when money was free, it was a historic level of development. Is that pretty much consistent with where you were?
Well, it wasn't I wouldn't say just a historic level of development. I would say more, it was a historic level of pricing, right? So when we think of inflation, we think of the consumer price index. Here, we were having inflation in terms of building pricing, not based on, the rents have increased. I mean, sometimes that's happened too, right? But not based on that, but based on really just the change in underlying cap rates.
Sure. Okay. And for those people who do not really know much about cap rates, there'll be people watching this who are maybe business owners, but not real estate centric. Can you sort of just explain that?
Sure. So it's a way of thinking about valuation of property. So if you say, well, I wanted my return on my investment to be 3%, then a property would be worth X number of dollars. But now all of a sudden, maybe I want my return to be 6%. So what that means is that same building is now worth half of what it was before. So what had happened previously is that by lowering cap rates from sort of, let's say they were at 5 to 10%, bringing them down to 3 to 5% may you doubled the value of certain buildings. Well, so the question is with the interest rates going up like that, have we now cut those buildings valuation in half? And to the extent those buildings have lost tenants, have we cut them in even more than in half, right? Which would be a really dramatic change for building owners.
Sure. And I assume that if you are somebody who either financed that building at a different cap rate or you own it and you're seeing your revenue stream going down and you're seeing tenants fleeing, whether they quit, they went out of business, they left because they didn't have the need, whatever it is, now you're seeing a disruptive change in what your ecosystem in that particular building or development is like.
Right. And you're right too, because it's the two trends hitting at the same place. It's the finance going up. So even if nothing else had changed, well, you'd say, oh, well, your building is now worth half of what it was before because of the expected return on investments to be competitive with just buying a T-bill, right? So we have that on the one side, and on the other side, as you started out by saying, we've had a pandemic that's changed use. So as a result, we've seen some valuations on office buildings in downtown Los Angeles that are literally like a third of what they were previously because tenants have left, or the tenants that are there are often saying, well, I have 2 years left on my lease, but I only want half the space when I go to renew in 2 years, right? So you're having more even of an expected contraction in usage, and that's getting combined with the idea that the rates are going up. And so if people have any sort of adjustment also in their financing, that's also going to put pressure on them.
Sure. And so I think people have heard about what happened with hotels in San Francisco that basically just gave the keys back to lenders. I assume there may be certain commercial buildings where that's going to be an issue too, which then, of course, gets back to you have a lot of, quote, density in building, but a lot of vacant property. So what is going on in the commercial markets these days? What are you seeing and where do you see it's going to go?
Right. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of heat around sort of industrially zoned and used property because there's a lot of mail order things and shipping and transshipping, repackaging, and some manufacturing has also come back more locally because it's being brought back. So that area has been relatively stable. Now, I can talk about that later in terms of development because financing has hit that area as well. But I'm saying that that's stable in terms of the buildings that are constructed, or relatively so. The hard places have been office and retail, both of which had some problems before the pandemic. Retail especially, right? We've been aware of the retail issues for years, but of course the pandemic just accelerated it.
Absolutely. And I know that we have some really good stuff to talk about later about some of the retail conversions and the stuff you did. But in the commercial side right now, what do you think is happening? What's their future? Do you see new development? Do you see conversion? Do you see, again, this is your people are coming to Paul when they have commercial office buildings and they're saying, this is what's going on. I don't want to be in a position where I have to give the keys back to the lender and say, hey, have fun with this. So what do you think is going to happen? What do you see now? How do you see it plays out over the next several years?
Well, no, you're right. And this is a lot of what we do is related to development and redevelopment. And people come in and say, I need to reposition. How do I get through the governmental hurdles? How do I get through the financial hurdles? How do I do construction contracts, et cetera? So yes, we're now seeing in office buildings a trend such as we've seen previously with retail. How do you convert it over? How do you do things with it? So first, I think that there has been a change in the idea of what people want for offices. So that's affected office use, and that causes or leads people to want to change and reformat the office to match the new office usages. Two, I think, right, there's an overabundance of office, and people have really talked about conversion of them, as you brought up. So if you wanted to say, well, we sort of started with our mega trends of what's affecting development, of saying, well, you've got financing, you've got the pandemic, and together we have a perfect storm. Well, on top of that, you have an issue, especially in California, with housing. And people have said, well, our real problem is a shortage of housing. So we might be overbuilt with retail, we might be overbuilt with offices, but we're underbuilt with housing. And folks are starting to ask, what do we need to do to convert? And we've obviously spent some time doing conversions previously, during other periods, but also now we're looking at how to do those conversions.
Sure. And so part of what I think people will want to understand and hear us talk about today. So as you know, in almost any area of business, there is some fear of missing out. Oh, so and so did this, and so we've got to do this. And people may come to you with with a commercial building and say, oh, I don't have tenants. I've got to convert to X. I've got to convert to some kind of mixed use or whatever it is, retail, residential. And they come to you and they want to talk to you about it. And because it worked for somebody in Nashville, I've got to do this in North Los Angeles. And from my understanding is there's all kinds of buildings in the commercial space, and some of them are very well suited for conversion and some aren't. So when you have people come talk to you, what kinds of things are you guys talking about?
Right, and you just hit it, right? The problem is we get trends in everything, and you think even when there was big money on it, people wouldn't be subject to trends, but of course they are. So I think we've all seen news where people say, oh, the solution to homeless people in downtown Los Angeles or San Francisco is to put them in office buildings, but that's very expensive. So let's talk first about, as you asked, like what are the sort of buildings that are sort of the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones to convert, and this has started before the pandemic. We've seen this shift, I think, in lower midtown Manhattan. We've seen it in downtown Los Angeles and a little bit in some other markets too, where the older office buildings that were built with smaller floor plates, meaning the floors, each story was a little bit smaller than they would be now, say 15,000 square feet versus a more modern 25,000 square feet. Those offices for a while now have been getting converted into residential use. Because if I were building a residential tower and stacking it with apartments instead of offices, I would probably build it at a 15,000 square foot floor plate. So those buildings are more easily convertible. Now, obviously, it's expensive because residential usages are different from non-residential usage, but you are getting the shell, you're getting certain infrastructure systems there, and often you can get those at a bargain price, and you may be able to get them, going forward at even more of a bargain price where it makes sense to use it. That sort of housing has not been cheap. I don't think any high-rise housing is as inexpensive as low-rise housing. So that has been an issue for when people want to create affordable housing in dense urban locations. So this has been more used traditionally for market rate housing, but I think there's real consideration now being given to using this for affordable housing, and it may be possible.
Sure. And when you see this shake out, like again, when there's so much disruption, when do you think we may sort of have enough institutional knowledge and expertise about what works and what doesn't to know if, again, these buildings with small floor plates are actually going to be successful at either market rate housing for the gentrification or affordable housing? Do you see this being very bumpy for the next couple of years? Do you think that this trend could no longer be a trend sooner than people think? What are you looking at here?
No, well, I think that this is a real trend and it is a real way to use those office buildings. I do think though that in the short run, right, we have bumps that are more financing related than usage related. So the problem we're having now, as you sort of brought up, is capital markets for financing of buildings have of any sort are really sort of caught in a tough bind right now. We have interest rates have increased. So if you go to borrow money, it's more expensive. And we've had, as we talked about, this sort of increase in cap rates, we have uh, investors, equity investors, wanting more of a return on their money. So you're getting squeezed in both places. And we've also had really high increases with construction costs that haven't yet come down. People are saying, oh, we think they're going to come down, but they haven't yet. We've also had a squeeze for financing on the regional banks, as we've seen by some of the bank failures. I think we had one yesterday. As we've seen from these bank failures, we've some of the regional banks are really squeezed by the fact that they've put money out long term and they're taking money in short term. So that sort of lending source isn't there anymore. That affects all sorts of developers, but and it affects the market rate residential developers. The interesting thing is it doesn't really affect the typical affordable housing developer. So I would expect to see these conversions start moving in the direction of affordable housing, at least in the short run.
Okay, and in terms of that, you are potentially facing the usual development challenges, again, the environmental impact, zoning, whether you have ingress, egress, all that, the need for municipal services, fire, police, etc. Particularly, you know that there's a perception outside of California that we're not the most regulatory friendly area. So, how do you see that working? And are those the kinds of things that you're going to address in your practice?
Sure. No, that's what we address. That's our sort of day in, day out existence. And California is a harder place than some other places to develop. The good thing about that, I think, from an investor standpoint, is that you have a limit on your competition. If you're competent and you can get it done, and you have the right counsel and you have the right way to get things through, you have a competitive advantage on other people. It's not an open field. It's a field where the people who are most intelligent, most knowledgeable about it, willing to take risks, can make more money, because it's not, Houston, where you just go out and, at least in my imagination of Houston, go out and buy a bulldozer and start building. Um, and we do see this being addressed. We do see, just really recently, over the last few years, the state legislature start to understand that we have a regulatory environment that discourages housing and discourages development. And there have been real steps taken, by the legislature and new laws to contradict that.
Okay, and in that regard, do you have a tension between local regulatory issues and what the state would like to see happen?
So you're going to have to come down here and practice real estate law with us. That's exactly what we're seeing. I mean, we're literally involved in lawsuits between the state and local governments right now. I mean, we're not representing one of them, right? But where our people are in those positions, because you do see this tension, our developers. So what's happened is the state has intentionally put themselves in contradiction to localities. Localities have historically, their power of a municipality, of a city, has been its zoning power, right? It can
Sure.
zone in, zone out. That's really been where its power has been. That's where they've been fundraising. So everyone is used to having that at the local level. Well, that's been problematic. So the state has come in and offered laws that allow you to either sidestep and just completely get away from local entities, or use the local codes more robustly. So, for example, a law that came in a few years ago that's been super successful, and frankly, most of our developers in urban settings use, is a law that says if you include some affordable housing in your housing project, you can increase your density and increase the number of units and the height and how big your floor area is. You can increase all those things. You basically apply a multiplier, say 1.5 times what the city says you have. And the state gives you that extra amount, and the city can't say no. So these have been wonderful tools for developers, and there's more of those sorts of laws that have come along now. So, for example, historically, you have these large sort of boulevards. I mean, I'm thinking of old Route 66 that runs from it runs all the way, I guess, to Chicago. I have to remember what the song, how the song goes, but you run all the way through. Well, Route 66 was back in the day covered with motels, gas stations, and it all really turned into retail that's now mostly moldering, outdated, not great. Well, the state just this year passed a law that said, well, you can go into those areas, and just because it says commercial doesn't mean you can't put residential there. And the cities have never wanted that, right? Because the cities, under just sort of flukes of California law, cities make more money on sales tax than on property tax. They've kept this like moldering, gross old liquor store. They'd rather have that than a new apartment building, because a new apartment building isn't going to make them money, and it's going to bring people in.
And it's understandable. And look, I'm sure you like I do see both sides of this. And from the city's perspective, it does sound like they're picking up the check, both again in the loss of sales tax and also sales tax revenue, but also the demand for municipal services. That people, of course, if you're doing a residential conversion, they have a lot more need for certain municipal services than a commercial tenant. And
No,
so
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
it's the whammy. And in connection with that, and you're sitting there, you've got clients who are, they have governments on both sides of them saying, do this, and the other one says, not on your life. And you have to get involved in going in front of planning professionals and dealing with their sorts of issues. And they're trying, maybe in some ways, to discourage a development or cause you to do something that will preserve their revenue. And at some level, it's easy to see that that's legitimate. Cities need to provide municipal services. And so if they don't have the revenue to do that, what happens?
No, you're absolutely right. This has been a problem. I don't know that the California tax laws will ever be changed enough to address it, but people are certainly aware of that. And so I think two things have happened. One, cities mostly have become less stubborn because they realize that, like, for a long time, they thought retail was going to come back. You'd go there and you'd say, that mall's dead, it's never coming back. And, the planners and the city council, nobody would believe you. Now, I think folks are getting it, and they're saying, well, what can we do to get some revenue?
Sure.
So I think that's been a big help. I think we have much more understanding there. But I also think on the other side, developers are trying to think of ways that do both for the cities. So, for example, we're talking about something that ran along Route 66. If I were going to propose a development there, I would probably go in and say, well, look, we want to put up this housing, but we want to put in this retail that will enliven the housing, right? We want to combine that. And yes, you're right that if it was all retail and no housing, you'd make more money, but you're never going to get all retail and no housing, right? That world doesn't exist. So what we're going to give you is we're going to give you as much retail as we can support, right? And there's going to be more to support because we're going to have more people there. So we're going to give you this retail, as much retail as we can support, and we will come in here and bring housing. And sometimes also you can find job components. I mean, I pitched something with the city some years ago where they were dead set against any kind of more medical usage because they're saying, no, medical isn't bringing us sales tax. We want our commercial saved for that. But they were right next to a huge medical center. So nobody really wanted it for retail. They wanted it for medical. So the sale there really had to be that the medical was bringing in jobs, and we had to show numbers for their actual sort of job base in that city and make an argument for why they needed to be for why they needed to do something that wasn't helping their bottom line, but was actually helping their community. And a lot of cities have gotten sensitive to that.
Understood. And so you previously said that there are the smaller floor plate type buildings that are much easier to convert. But then when you have office space in cherry areas where they're not easy to convert, and of course there's a retail ecosystem around them, so you have lots of sales tax, and now people aren't coming to the office, what's going to happen there? How's that going to shake out?
Right. So this is really interesting because now you're getting into the future, Carl, right? This is what hasn't happened yet. People haven't aggressively, reused, done adaptive reuse projects on what are mostly newer buildings, right? So these large floor plate buildings in cherry areas are all ones that are built from, say, the 80s on. So they're all fairly recent, right? I mean, in the lifespan of a large building, that's not that old. And so those are the buildings that I think are open to being targeted the way you're saying. Now, I think it's going to be expensive, right? Because they're expensive buildings to begin with. But as we've seen, we start out by saying that we've seen property values decrease, but where you have a property that's now worth a third of what it was. And
Sure.
there's some examples of that in downtown Los Angeles right now, right, where buildings are going back to the lenders and people are saying, we don't care, we're done with it. And you have a lender who's owed maybe 550 million and has a valuation of maybe 350 million. So once these things start going down, we saw a trade recently that was between 125 and $150 a square foot. Well, that's nuts. That's way less than it would ever take to build that, right? So even if you're ripping things out of it, it's still pretty cheap. So I think their opportunity here is to go into some of these larger floor plate buildings and make them more attractive both for offices and for residential. The same building may combine both, or you may spread it out over different buildings, but I think they can coexist. What we've seen in malls is folks come in and sort of deconstruct the mall form. Now, this is only being done in higher end areas, right? If you have a mall in a tough area, nobody's going to come in and spend that kind of money. But if you have a mall in a prime area, we've seen developers come in and say, well, we're going to keep this portion of the skeleton, and then we're going to change this other portion. You can do that vertically as well as horizontally.
And horizontally versus vertically, you mean what?
We could do it in a high rise. The mall is sort of think of it as a high rise turned on its side,
Mhm.
and the high rise is going up and down. So obviously it's more expensive, maybe not obviously, but it's more expensive going up and down. But there's also all that value, right? We're paying for the view. I could look out my office and see people on a golf course or people at the beach. We pay for that view. And it's worth it, right? So I think that you're going to see transfers in these sort of larger floor plate buildings with the valuation coming down in terms of rents. People are going to say, oh, the opportunity cost is not that great if I were to open something up. So maybe I take 2 floors and turn them into 1 floor, right? So that you have a high ceiling and a mezzanine. I mean, there's fire code, there's all sorts of issues, right? But that's a way to break stuff up and get a more modern form of office. You're also, I think, going to see people tearing off the skin and doing what are really interior balconies so that we have exterior areas brought into the interior of the building. Now, that does a couple things, right? That helps in a modern office where we know that people are working less in, like an office like I have. Lawyers still like the old days, but new places, new types of firms doing new sorts of business are much more open floor plan with communal spaces. And those communal spaces go well double height, they go well having exterior, right? The things that people want to rent for offices are much more like a campus than the old, the Mad Men style high rise.
Sure, and I understand that, and I wonder if in connection with that, if some of these office buildings could have ground level retail, which makes the city happy because there's sales taxes, and then some living space in there, and then some office space in one particular structure, you could have the best of all worlds.
Absolutely. When you start breaking it up like that, you can have retail. You can have like a sun-filled corridor that comes into that retail. You can move up and then you can have a terrace with a restaurant on it. You can move through, you can have offices, open that up a little bit. And also then for residential, I start out by saying, well, residential doesn't like large floor plates because you need to put rooms in it. Like if you've ever gone to your friend's loft and it's 5,000 square feet and there's windows on one side and it's dark everywhere else, right? Like hipsters in Brooklyn are still going to like that, but that really isn't something that's that marketable. But once you start opening this up, right? If we said, well, now I have a building, but I have a couple slices out of it, I could have light and sunlight and outdoor areas in my apartment. So you could bring those all together. We've also seen, green buildings. One of the new techs that I just love that has gotten some play again in higher end settings is the whole thing of, you can make the entire skin of a building a hydroponic garden. Now, I'm not saying that we need to do that everywhere, but that's the kind of thing that would get you a garden feel on your 45th story apartment.
That's incredible. That's incredible. So look, I want to turn your attention to some of the mall conversions because there's seems to be more experience of that than others. You've seen a lot. You've been involved in a bunch. When have they gone right and when have they gone wrong? What is your experience in that?
Well, so again, with all of these things, it's sort of a deep pocket play. So where I've seen malls go wrong is where you get folks who are sort of distress buyers and they buy it and they're trying to eke out a living off the few remaining tenants. That's problematic. The other thing that's been problematic is that malls weren't designed with change in mind. So you have all sorts of they're mostly encumbered with a lot of easements and long-term agreements, so that you might be a retailer, you might have no business and no reason really to even keep the store open, except by keeping that store open, you can charge millions and millions of dollars to allow the developer to use the surface parking lot around it for something else. So we see, formerly successful retail businesses staying in position just to take that blocking position. So there's a lot of malls that have been tied up for years in that kind of legal wrangling, which I think is a tip for the future, right? Whenever you're developing something, remember that change happens. And in the 60s and 70s, nobody thought change would happen for malls. So we have that out there. But now the ones that have been successful, in my experience, have mostly been in urban areas where the value of the property makes it is high enough that you can afford to spend money. And what we've seen, I'll give an example, Century City, the mall across the street from me. I can look out and see it. They had a mall that was always, fairly successful among malls, but it certainly come down in its success level. Prior to the pandemic, they repositioned it by adding a lot of, experiential type retail versus buying something retail, right? And that's been the trend. Folks, if you want to buy a new shirt, you go online. But if you want to go to a movie, well, before the pandemic, you would go to the movie. Or if you wanted to go to the restaurant before the pandemic, you would go to a restaurant. So they've tried to reposition in that sense. They've also thought about, well, what else could go into a mall? Historically, mall covenants would have prevented anyone from ever bringing medical into a mall or ever bringing a gym into a mall. Or bowling alleys. People hated bowling alleys. Who knows why? Now we see changes where people are actually putting those sorts of things into the mall and it attracts people. Problem we had on that is I think that model was really centered on the pre-pandemic world where there was a thought that people really did want to gather. But we have an example in downtown Los Angeles. A client of ours has a mall called The Block. And it was built in the 70s. And, it's maybe 5 stories of concrete block walls, that were blank to all sides. And they took it and they had the guts to come in and just basically rip it open, rip the face off of it, get rid of a bunch of the retail that wasn't doing well. Now they have really strong retail with street exposure. They have they have a lot of restaurants and bars. They added a connection so that they can be the station for a subway stop. So you have people coming through for that, so that even in the pandemic, they were doing decent numbers. Some of their restaurants were doing better numbers than they'd ever done because they had so much open space where people could come and hang out, and they wanted to do that.
That's excellent. And so, turning to some stuff about your practice and your experience. So, I think that unless people are full time developers or they're in charge at a company at a high level in real estate procurement, I'm not sure they actually know what someone like you does that goes beyond the formulaic or draft this, draft that. So, why don't you talk about why your services and how your services are very valuable to people who need help in the development space?
Right. That's you bring something up. A lot of our clients are not developers. I mean, we have folks that are just developers who I just spoke about, but we have a lot of institutions that isn't their primary business. So they're coming to us for expertise, beyond just like, oh, can you draft this, contract with our general contractor, which of course we can do, but it's sort of expertise around that, beyond that. And that gets into sort of regulatory issues, finance issues, issues in terms of, what sort of benefits can you sometimes get from various governmental entities. Sort of a more fulsome look at what is the project. And that's where I think we've been good, is to be able to, be creative. I think we try and go in, listen to what folks are trying to do. Sometimes it's completely new and it's just fun, right? Because they like, the first time somebody said, we can make a parking garage that looks like a green cube by putting plants all over it. You're like, that's marvelous. And now we could entitle a parking garage where we couldn't have before, right? Because people would say, well, I hate parking structures. Nobody hates green cubes. So that's the sort of thing that we like to work with. And I think what we're good at is listening to what it is people want to do, and then working with them on sort of an overall strategy of how to get there. And then, it's like your show, you called it block and tackle. And you've got the block and tackle, the thing that helps you when you lift your engine out or lift a heavy weight. But I also think of blocking and tackling in a football game, right? That's the really basic thing that they teach you how to do. And that's a lot of what we have to end up doing too, right? Is you have to just go out there, do the work, carry the ball, and get it done, right? And it's bruising, but it has to get done.
But it sounds like in connection with that blocking and tackling, you have to appreciate the financing aspect of it, the planning aspect of it, the environmental impact, the energy impact, the density, all the regulations that you have to deal with state and local, the amount of time it's going to take to get it, what the business and marketing plan will be once all of this is done. You're involved probably from the very beginning all the way to the full execution.
Yes. I mean, that's certainly our preference. The earlier in, I mean, sometimes we come in later and you're trying to cure for mistakes that could have been never have been made. So we come in at all sorts of different stages, but yes, we're often in at the earliest planning stage, because at that stage you might be able to give guidance and say, well, you could build that, but you could not do this one section maybe and save millions of dollars or a year in time or whatever it is that's connected to it. I mean, we have those conversations routinely. I had somebody yesterday say, well, we really need a mid-block crossing to go with this, and we need our entitlements in 9 months. And I was like, well, we can get your entitlements in 9 months, and we can go back and get your mid-block crossing if you ever really want it, right? So by getting in early, we can help steer folks towards a workable solution that gets them, 95% of what they want, and does it in a way that's, budget, but with an acceptable budget and an acceptable timeline. I mean, time is the issue, Carl, with construction and development projects, right? And it eats up. And this has been an issue with capital costs, right? When capital cost approached zero, you saw people not caring as much about time. Now with capital costs rising, time is going to go back, is going to become much more expensive.
Understood. But it sounds like if we're recapping, what your sort of secret sauce is the ability to sort of see the 3 or 4 dimensional chess that goes into assessing the feasibility and helping your client plan it and execute it, which not everybody can do. Not everybody has the connections. Not everybody has been in front of planning boards. Not everybody knows the temperature of what's going on, which way the winds are blowing, what the competition is doing, what the strategic issues that are involved in all aspects of this. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, but that's business, Carl, right? The more things you can keep in your mind at once, the better you tend to do.
Now, I appreciate that. So, Paul, it's been really great having you on the show. We may have you back again. And I appreciate your time. I'm sure the listeners are really, and viewers are really going to like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've been so happy. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.